Bush and Adams. I'll say this about that. We'll get into some questions and answers and comments. I'd like to hear your comments about this because I'm here to learn from you too. I was intrigued by the fact that both a Bush and an Adams became president, and what did they do differently? And I found very quickly they couldn't compare them. Not only were they divided by centuries and cultures, but their method of child raising too was very, very different. The John Quincy Adams experience, in my opinion, from a parental standpoint, was an aberration. It was an accident. John Adams went to France with his 11-year-old son, John Quincy, with him. They lived in one room together. They did not know the language. They could not trust Benjamin Franklin, who was the other American there on the team. And they only had each other. They had no television. And a father undoubtedly shared with a son things that he would never share in any other circumstance. It is a rare moment in time. Two men, one 11-year-old boy and another a man in his late 40s, living in the same room, both future presidents of the United States, and they got nothing to see or read or talk to but each other. And they learned the French language together. And John Adams was a bit stunned and a bit hurt that John Quincy learned French quicker than he did. Of course, today we all know why. I mean, we could even, with biofeedbacks, they can even show us how our brain works and why kids learn language quicker than adults do. But John Adams was convinced that his young son was a genius. And John Quincy gained confidence from that he drew on for the rest of his life, because he knew that his dad wasn't faking it, that his dad was really impressed with him. And John Quincy went on to a great career when he was 14 years old. It was a pretty rare thing to have someone that we could trust in the American government who could actually speak French, which of course was the diplomatic language, so we needed him. And he was immediately assigned to a legation, and very quickly, as a young man, he became an ambassador. His career was on his way. As an old man, John Quincy became intrigued with the whole idea of genius. And he wrote a number of essays about what is genius, and he came to the conclusion that genius was just focusing on a particular thing. And I found it interesting because it seemed to me that his genius betrayed him at the end. He couldn't solve a lot of the problems he wanted to solve, even in his own family, and came to the conclusion, maybe realized finally that, hey, I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, but whatever it was, it took him to the top. And the reason I say it was an aberration is because the other brother, Charles, the dad, says, this worked so good with John Quincy, I'm going to go home and do it with Charles. So he comes back to the United States and he tells Abigail, this is so fantastic, and let's take Charles back to Europe. So he takes Charles back to Europe, but brings along John Quincy. Can't do without John Quincy. So now they get to France, and they're back at the same court, but John Adams' conclusion was it was his stern admonitions and supervisions of John Quincy that made him great, and his exposure to a foreign culture. So when he comes back, by now, John Adams can speak French, John Quincy can speak French. When they go out to dinner, when they go to events, nobody's there to interpret for Charles. He's got to learn on his own. It doesn't work. And very soon they're separated. They're going to school, John Quincy and Charles. The dad's at another apartment. Doesn't work. The dad can't figure it out. I mean, Charles dies an alcoholic at a young age. John Quincy grows up convinced that his dad's stern control and admonition and strictness and exposure to a foreign culture is what made him great. He tries it with his own kids and it doesn't work. His firstborn son commits suicide. His second son struggles and again has an alcoholic problem, dies young, at the age of 31. In fact, he has an interesting letter to his second son. His second son is at Harvard, and John Quincy Adams says, he's president now. He's the sitting president. He says, I'm not going to come to your Harvard graduation unless you're in your top 25 of your class. So the son works like a dog, and he gets in the top 25, and he gets to 5. And the dad writes him a letter and says, if you're not number 1, it's not worth doing. And so the father says, I'm not coming anyway. And John Adams II is soon after expelled from Harvard and doesn't finish it and dies young. So in my opinion, and of course I could be wrong, but I'll let you read it. I don't give my opinion in the book. I just state the facts. I think John Quincy was an accident, an aberration. And we've learned a lot more about parenting. One of the things you'll notice in the appendix is I chart the life and death of these children, and prior to the Civil War, a presidential child